The morning sun painted golden streaks across Mrs. Dorothy Washington's front yard as she knelt beside her beloved rose garden. At 68 years old, she still found pure joy in these quiet moments, watching her flowers reach toward the sky. The sweet scent of blooming roses filled the air, mixing with the earthy smell of fresh soil beneath her worn gardening gloves. She had been up since dawn, just like every Tuesday morning for the past 15 years, since retiring from teaching third grade at the local elementary school. Her morning routine was simple but brought her immense satisfaction. A cup of chamomile tea on the porch, watching the neighborhood come alive, followed by gentle stretches to ease her arthritis, and then tending to her award-winning roses. The roses weren't just flowers to Dorothy, they were living memories. Each bush had its own story. The climbing rose near the fence was planted when she first bought the house in 1982, back when the neighborhood was different, when most of her original neighbors still lived here. The yellow roses by the mailbox were from her late husband's mother, who had taught her everything she knew about gardening. The red ones in the center had won first prize at the county fair 3 years running. As she carefully pruned away dead leaves, she hummed an old gospel tune her grandmother used to sing. The familiar melody carried her through the morning's work, her experienced hands moving with practiced precision despite the slight tremor that had developed in recent years. A light breeze rustled through the oak trees lining her street, carrying the distant sounds of children waiting for their school bus 2 blocks away. Dorothy's Victorian home stood as a testament to decades of love and care. The pale blue paint was fresh from last summer's touch-up, the white trim gleaming in the morning light. She and her late husband had saved for years to buy this house, and she had maintained it meticulously ever since. Every squeak in the floorboards, every creak in the stairs held a memory of family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and quiet Sunday afternoons. The neighborhood had changed around her over the years. Most of the older residents had either passed on or moved to retirement communities, replaced by younger families who barely had time to wave hello between their busy schedules. Still, Dorothy made an effort to know everyone, often sharing cuttings from her roses or offering gardening advice to newcomers trying to spruce up their yards. She was just about to take a break and get some water when she heard the distinct sound of car engines idling nearby. Something about the sound made her pause. It wasn't the usual quick pass of delivery trucks or neighbors heading to work. The sound grew louder, and suddenly 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of her house, their presence immediately changing the peaceful atmosphere of the morning. Dorothy slowly stood up, her knees protesting the movement after kneeling for so long. She still held her pruning shears, the well-worn handles familiar in her grip. The morning sun that had felt so warm and comforting moments ago now seemed harsh and exposing as she watched 4 officers step out of their vehicles, their hands hovering near their weapons. Her heart began to beat faster, but years of experience as a teacher had taught her to keep her exterior calm even when facing unexpected situations. She straightened her back, adjusted her gardening hat, and took a deep breath, all while maintaining the dignified presence she had carried throughout her life. The officers approached her property with an urgency that seemed completely out of place on this quiet morning. Dorothy couldn't help but notice how they moved, tactical, practiced steps that seemed more suited for approaching a dangerous situation than speaking to a grandmother in her garden. Their boots left heavy impressions in her carefully maintained lawn, crossing invisible boundaries without hesitation. She thought about her neighbors watching from their windows, Mrs. Chen across the street who always brought her Chinese herbs when she was under the weather, the new family next door with their toddler who would wave excitedly whenever she saw Dorothy in the garden. What would they think seeing this scene unfold? More importantly, what had brought these officers to her doorstep with such apparent urgency? The morning birds had gone quiet, as if they too sensed the shift in atmosphere. The only sounds now were the heavy footsteps approaching and the slight rustle of equipment on the officers' belts. Dorothy stood her ground, one hand still holding her pruning shears, the other adjusting her glasses, a gesture she had always used to give herself a moment to think when faced with challenging situations in her classroom. As the officers drew closer, Dorothy noticed details that would stick with her long afterward. The way the youngest officer's hands trembled slightly near his holster, how the morning sun glinted off their badges, the way their shadows stretched across her roses like dark fingers reaching into her peaceful world. She thought about all the conversations she'd had with her son about moments like these, all the stories she'd heard at church about similar encounters, all the times she'd prayed it wouldn't happen to her. Yet here she was, standing in her own garden, surrounded by the roses she had nurtured for decades, about to face a moment she had hoped would never come. The morning that had started with such peaceful promise was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would not only change her life, but would ripple through her entire community. The lead officer's voice cut through the morning silence like a knife. "Ma'am, we've received a report about suspicious activity at this residence." The words hung in the air, as out of place in her garden as snow in summer, marking the moment her peaceful morning transformed into something entirely different. Dorothy took another deep breath, drawing strength from the generations of strong women in her family who had faced their own challenges with grace and dignity. She was about to need every ounce of that strength. The lead officer's words seemed to hang in the air like heavy storm clouds. "Ma'am, we've had reports of suspicious activity at this address." His hand remained near his weapon as he spoke, a detail that didn't escape Dorothy's notice. She had spent 40 years teaching children to read body language. She could read theirs all too well. Suspicious activity. Dorothy's voice remained steady, though her heart was racing beneath her gardening shirt. "I've been out here since sunrise, officer, tending to my roses. I haven't seen anything suspicious." She gestured to her garden tools and the neat piles of pruned leaves beside her. The second officer, a younger man with a clean-shaven face, stepped forward. His boots crushed one of her newly sprouted tulips, and Dorothy felt a small pain in her chest at the sight. "We received a call about a possible break-in," he stated, his eyes scanning the front of her house. "Someone reported an elderly person who doesn't match the neighborhood demographic entering this property." Dorothy's grip tightened slightly on her pruning shears before she consciously relaxed her fingers. She'd heard those words before, "doesn't match the demographic," at community meetings, in hushed conversations at church, in the stories her friends shared over Sunday dinner. Now here they were, served up on her own front lawn like an unwelcome dish. "I've lived in this house for 43 years, she said calmly, reaching slowly into her pocket. "My ID and property documents are right here in May. Keep your hands where we can see them." The sharp command came from a third officer who had begun circling toward her back porch. Dorothy froze, her hands still halfway to her pocket, feeling the weight of their gazes like physical pressure on her skin. "I'm just reaching for my wallet," she explained, using the same patient tone she had once used with frightened children on their first day of school. "It has my identification and—" "Ma'am, step away from the gardening tools," the first officer interrupted, his hand now fully resting on his weapon. Dorothy looked down at her pruning shears, the ones her husband had given her for their 30th anniversary, their handles worn smooth from years of use. Slowly, carefully, she placed them on the ground. The fourth officer had already made his way around the side of the house, peering through windows without permission. Dorothy could hear him rattling the side gate, checking locks. Each sound felt like an invasion, a violation of the sanctuary she had built over 4 decades. "This is a misunderstanding," Dorothy said, keeping her voice level despite the tremor trying to work its way up from her chest. "I'm Dorothy Washington. I bought this house with my late husband in 1982. I have all the documentation." "We'll need to verify that," the lead officer cut in. "The property records we have access to show different information." This was a lie, and Dorothy knew it. She had paid off her mortgage 15 years ago, had never missed a property tax payment, had all her papers in perfect order. The morning sun had grown hotter, beating down on Dorothy's shoulders as she stood in her own garden feeling like a stranger. Her roses, usually such a source of pride and joy, now seemed to be watching helplessly as their caretaker faced this ordeal. The red blooms she had been tending to earlier bobbed gently in the breeze, spattering drops of dew like tears onto the grass. From the corner of her eye, Dorothy could see curtains twitching in neighboring windows. Her neighbors were watching, some probably the very ones who had called the police. She thought of all the times she had brought them fresh-baked sweet potato pies, had watched their children when they ran errands, had taught some of them in her classroom years ago. The young officer was now questioning her about her daily routine, about who else had access to the house, about why she was outside so early in the morning. Each question felt like a small cut, a suggestion that her normal life was somehow suspicious, that her very existence in this space needed justification. "I garden every morning," she explained, fighting to keep the wariness from her voice. "I'm a retired teacher. Gardening is my joy. Anyone in this neighborhood could tell you that. Mrs. Chen across the street brings me tea while I work sometimes. The Thompsons next door." "Ma'am, we're not interested in your gardening schedule," the lead officer interrupted again. "We need to see some identification and proof of residence, right now." Dorothy looked at her pruning shears on the ground, at the roses she had been tending, at the house she had called home for nearly half a century. She thought of all the times she had told her students to stand up for themselves while staying safe, to be proud while being prudent. Now she had to live those lessons. "I understand you're doing your job," she said carefully, each word measured and clear. "But I am telling you that this is my home. I have lived here since before some of you were born. My identification is in my pocket, and I would like to show it to you, but every time I try to reach for it, you treat me like I'm a threat." The officers exchanged glances, their stance still tense, their hands still near their weapons. The morning had grown uncomfortably warm, and Dorothy could feel sweat rolling down her back. She had planned to finish her gardening, and then make a batch of her famous lemonade, maybe share some with the new family that had moved in down the street. Instead, here she was, being treated like a criminal in her own front yard. The youngest officer shifted his weight, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Perhaps he saw something in Dorothy's steady gaze that reminded him of his own grandmother, or maybe he was just beginning to realize how this scene might look to the growing number of observers in neighboring windows. A car engine sounded in the distance, growing louder as it approached. Dorothy didn't turn to look, keeping her attention focused on the officers in front of her. But something about the sound made the officers glance toward the street, their postures shifting slightly. The morning was about to take another unexpected turn, one that would transform this confrontation in ways none of them could predict. Dorothy stood in her garden, feeling the warm earth beneath her feet through her worn gardening shoes. The morning had grown heavy with tension, but she drew strength from memories of other challenges she'd faced in her 68 years. She thought of her mother's words, spoken long ago, "Stand tall, baby girl. Your dignity is not theirs to take." The pruning shears lay where she had placed them, catching the sunlight like a forgotten promise. She could feel a familiar ache in her knees from gardening, but she refused to show any sign of discomfort. 40 years of teaching had taught her that showing weakness often invited more pressure, more scrutiny. As the officers continued their questioning, Dorothy's mind drifted to her classroom at Washington Elementary. She had handled countless difficult situations there: angry parents, frightened children, school board meetings that turned hostile. She had learned to maintain her composure even when her heart was racing, to speak softly when others raised their voices, to stand firm when others tried to push her down. "Ma'am, who else has access to this property?" The lead officer's question pulled her back to the present. His tone suggested he was losing patience with her calm responses. "As I mentioned before," Dorothy replied, her voice steady as a summer breeze. "I live here alone since my husband passed. My son visits regularly. He's actually Duto." She caught herself, deciding to keep that information close for now. Years of experience had taught her the value of holding some cards in reserve. The youngest officer was now walking along her flower beds, his heavy boots dangerously close to her prized pink roses. Dorothy watched him with the same expression she had used when students got too close to the class hamster cage. Alert but outwardly calm. Inside, each step near her beloved flowers made her heart skip. She could hear whispers from neighboring houses now. Through the corner of her eye, she saw Mrs. Chen step onto her porch across the street, phone in hand. The elderly woman's presence brought a small measure of comfort. Someone else was watching, witnessing. Mr. Thompson next door had come out to check his mail for the third time in 10 minutes. The morning sun had climbed higher, and Dorothy could feel sweat rolling down her back beneath her gardening shirt. She thought of all the Sunday services where Pastor Brown had talked about maintaining grace under pressure. The true test of character, he would say, comes not when people treat you right, but when they treat you wrong. One of the officers was speaking into his radio now, requesting information about property records. Dorothy almost smiled, thinking of the thick folder in her study containing every document related to her home, deed, mortgage papers, paid in full 15 years ago, tax receipts, even the original sales contract from 1982. She had kept everything because her father had taught her that a black woman in America needed to document everything twice over. Her hands wanted to tremble, but she kept them still, clasped loosely in front of her. She thought of her garden club meetings, where she taught newer members about patience, about how some flowers needed time to bloom, about how the strongest roots often grew in the hardest soil. Right now, she was living those lessons. "Ma'am," the lead officer spoke again, "you understand we have to investigate any reports of suspicious activity." His tone suggested he was trying to sound reasonable, but the words still carried an edge. "I understand completely," Dorothy replied, her voice carrying the same gentle authority she had used with generations of third graders. "And you understand that I am a homeowner standing in my own garden, being treated like an intruder on property I've owned longer than some of you have been alive." The words hung in the air like the humidity before a summer storm. Dorothy saw something flicker in the younger officer's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or uncertainty. She had seen that look before, in students who suddenly realized they might be wrong about something they had been very sure of moments ago. More neighbors had emerged from their homes now. The Thompson children, who usually waited for their school bus inside their garage, stood on their driveway watching. Dorothy felt a different kind of ache, knowing they were witnessing this scene. She had taught their older sister in her last year before retiring, had helped their mother plant her first vegetable garden. She thought of all the conversations at church about moments like these, all the stories shared over coffee and cake after services. "Keep your head up," the older women would say. "Know your rights, but keep your cool." Some had lost sons, brothers, husbands to moments that started just like this, routine questions that escalated because someone got frightened or angry. A bead of sweat rolled down Dorothy's temple, but she resisted the urge to wipe it away. Any sudden movement might be misinterpreted, and she had worked too hard, lived too long, to let a moment of discomfort undo her careful composure. The morning birds had resumed their singing, a strange counterpoint to the tense scenario unfolding in her garden. Dorothy focused on their familiar songs, letting the sound remind her of countless peaceful mornings spent among her roses. This moment would pass, like all moments do, but how she handled it would ripple out into her community. She thought of her late husband, how he had always told her she was the strongest person he knew. "Not because you never get scared," he'd say, "but because you keep your dignity even when you're afraid." Standing in her garden now, surrounded by officers who saw her as a threat and neighbors who knew her as a friend, she felt his words wrap around her like a shield. The sound of another car approaching made her straighten her spine just a bit more. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Mothers always know when their children are near. The morning was about to change again, but Dorothy Washington would face whatever came next the same way she had faced everything in her life, with grace, with strength, and with unshakable dignity. The sleek black sedan turned onto Rose Street just as it had every Tuesday morning for the past 5 years. Dorothy's son always visited on Tuesdays. It was their standing breakfast date, a tradition that had started after his father passed away. But today, as he approached his childhood home, the familiar sight of his mother's garden was disrupted by the presence of 2 police cruisers parked at awkward angles across the front of the property. His legal training kicked in immediately, years of handling civil rights cases flooding his mind with precedents and procedures. He slowed his car, deliberately taking in every detail of the scene. 4 officers, his mother standing in her garden, neighbors watching from their porches. His dash camera was already running, a habit he developed years ago, but he pulled out his phone and started recording as well. The morning sun glinted off his cufflinks as he parked his car at a careful distance from the police cruisers. Every movement was measured, deliberate. He had handled dozens of cases that started just like this, had sat through countless testimonies of similar situations. Now it was happening at his own mother's home. He reached for his briefcase with his right hand, keeping his phone recording with his left. The leather bag contained case files he planned to review over breakfast with his mother. Instead, it would serve as a silent reminder of his profession. His footsteps were steady as he walked toward the scene, his Oxford shoes clicking against the pavement in a rhythm that reminded him of his father's walk, confident, purposeful, unhurried. "Good morning, officers," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. His mother didn't turn to look at him, maintaining her dignified stance, but he saw her shoulders relax slightly. He noted how she stood among her roses, proud and straight-backed despite her arthritis, still wearing her gardening gloves and sun hat. The officers turned at the sound of his voice, their postures shifting as they registered his appearance, the tailored suit, the leather briefcase, the phone obviously recording. The youngest officer's hand moved away from his weapon, a small but significant gesture that didn't go unnoticed. "Sir, this is an active investigation. Please stay back," the lead officer commanded, but Dorothy's son continued his calm approach, his phone steady in his hand. "I'm Mrs. Washington's son," he stated clearly, his voice carrying the weight of countless courtroom appearances. "I'm also a civil rights attorney with the law firm of Washington and Associates." He paused, letting that information sink in. "Would you mind explaining why you're questioning my mother in her own garden without probable cause?" The atmosphere shifted perceptibly. The lead officer's stance changed, becoming more professional and less confrontational. "We received a call about suspicious activity. Could you be more specific about the nature of this suspicious activity?" Dorothy's son interrupted, his tone remaining courteous but firm. "And I'd appreciate it if you could all provide your badge numbers for my records." His phone continued recording, capturing every word, every reaction. The morning breeze carried the scent of his mother's roses, the same roses he had helped her plant after his father's funeral, the ones that had won ribbons at the county fair. He remembered helping her garden as a child, learning patience and persistence as they tended the flowers together. Now those same lessons served him in courtrooms and consultations. He noticed Mrs. Chen across the street, still recording on her phone. Mr. Thompson had moved closer to his fence, pretending to trim hedges that didn't need trimming. The Thompson children should have left for school by now, but they remained on their driveway, witnesses to a scene that would likely become a topic of discussion at their dinner table. "My mother has lived in this house for 43 years, he continued, his voice carrying just enough to reach the gathering neighbors. "She's a retired teacher who taught many of your children and grandchildren at Washington Elementary. She serves on the neighborhood council and hosts the annual garden club meetings." He took another step forward, careful to keep his movements slow and visible. "Now, I'm very interested in knowing who called in this complaint and what exactly made my mother's gardening appear suspicious to them." His words carried a weight that came from years of depositions and court appearances. The lead officer shifted his weight, glancing at his partners. The youngest officer had already taken several steps back, his discomfort with the situation now evident. The one who had been checking the windows had emerged from around the house, perhaps realizing how his actions might look in the inevitable review of this incident. "We have a duty to investigate all calls," the lead officer began, but Dorothy's son raised his hand slightly, the gesture both polite and commanding. "Of course you do," he agreed, his tone reasonable. "And I have a duty to ensure my mother's civil rights are protected. Now, would you like to see her identification and property documents, or shall we continue this discussion at my office with the department's legal representation present?" He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made any aggressive moves, but his presence had changed the dynamic completely. Years of handling similar cases had taught him the power of calm authority, of knowing exactly what to say and how to say it. The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows across his mother's garden. In the distance, a school bus humped its horn, a reminder that normal life continued beyond this tense scene. The Thompson children finally turned toward the sound, reluctantly heading toward their bus stop, though they kept glancing back over their shoulders. Dorothy still hadn't moved from her spot among the roses, her dignity intact despite the morning's ordeal. Her son knew that later, over a rescheduled breakfast, she would tell him about every moment leading up to his arrival. They would discuss it calmly, as they had discussed so many similar incidents affecting their friends and community members. But for now, he kept his attention focused on the officers, his phone steady, his presence a reminder that this seemingly routine police call had just become something much more significant. Dorothy's son moved with the careful precision of someone who had handled delicate situations countless times before. His phone continued recording as he pulled out a small notebook from his breast pocket, the same one he used to take notes in countless civil rights cases over the years. "Let's start with the basics," he said, his voice carrying the perfect balance of authority and courtesy. I'll need all of your badge numbers and names for the record. He paused, pen poised over paper. And please be aware that this interaction is being recorded not only by me but by several neighbors. He gestured subtly to Mrs. Chen's porch, where the elderly woman still stood with her phone raised. The lead officer cleared his throat, glancing at his colleagues. The Morning Sun caught his badge as he shifted, making the numbers clearly visible. Officer Wilson, badge number 4573, he said, his tone notably more professional than it had been moments before. One by one, the other officers followed suit, their earlier aggression melting away under the steady gaze of someone who clearly knew the law as well as they did, perhaps better. Thank you, officers. Dorothy's son wrote each name and number carefully, his handwriting as precise as it had been in law school. Now, I understand you received a call about suspicious activity. I'd like to know the exact nature of this reported activity, the time of the call, and the specific probable cause that led you to approach my mother without announcing yourselves properly. The youngest officer looked increasingly uncomfortable, his earlier bravado replaced by what appeared to be genuine regret. Dorothy remained standing among her roses, watching her son work with the same pride she'd felt when he graduated law school, when he'd won his first case, when he opened his own firm. We received a call at approximately 7:45 a.m. Officer Wilson began, consulting his own notebook. The caller reported. He hesitated, perhaps realizing how the words would sound in the clear morning air, with phones recording and neighbors watching. Please continue, Dorothy's son prompted, his pen never stopping. The exact words of the caller are particularly relevant here. Officer Wilson cleared his throat again. The caller reported, and I quote, an elderly person who doesn't seem to belong in the neighborhood in the garden of this residence. I see. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of countless similar cases, countless similar assumptions. And did the caller specify what they meant by doesn't seem to belong? Did they provide any actual evidence of criminal activity? The silence that followed was answer enough. Dorothy's son continued writing, the scratch of his pen against paper the only sound besides the morning birds. The rose bushes cast dappled shadows across the grass, peaceful witnesses to this tense exchange. Officers, I'm sure you're aware of Title 42, United States Code, Section 1983, regarding civil action for deprivation of rights. His voice remained conversational, as if discussing the weather. And of course, you're familiar with the Fourth Amendment's protections against unreasonable search and seizure. I noticed one of your colleagues was peering through windows without a warrant. The officer who had been checking the windows shifted his weight uncomfortably. Dorothy's son made a note of the movement, just as he'd noted every detail since arriving. Years of courtroom experience had taught him the value of documenting everything. My mother has lived in this house for 43 years, he continued, turning to a fresh page in his notebook. She's a retired educator who taught at Washington Elementary for 4 decades. She serves on the neighborhood council and has won the county garden competition 3 years running. He paused, letting each fact sink in. Yet someone saw her gardening in her own yard and decided she was suspicious enough to warrant police intervention. A car passed slowly down the street, its driver rubbernecking at the scene. More neighbors had emerged from their houses, standing in small clusters on their lawns. The morning had become a living lesson in community dynamics and law enforcement interaction. I'd like to file a formal request for the body camera footage from all officers present, he stated, writing as he spoke. I'll also need a copy of the dispatch call and any related incident reports. My office will submit the official request this afternoon, but I'm informing you now so there's no confusion about preservation of evidence. The officers exchanged glances. This routine call had evolved into something far more complex, and they all knew it. Dorothy's son noted their reactions, just as he noted everything. The way the youngest officer kept glancing at his mother's roses, the way Officer Wilson's hand had moved completely away from his weapon, the way the morning sun cast everything in stark, revealing light. Ma'am, Officer Wilson turned to Dorothy, his tone now respectful, almost apologetic. Would you be willing to show us your identification? Purely to complete our report. Dorothy looked at her son, who nodded almost imperceptibly. She reached slowly into her pocket and produced her wallet, handling it with the same care she used with her precious roses. Her driver's license showed the same address they were standing at, The same name she'd given them earlier, the same face that had looked out over classrooms of children for 40 years. "I'd also have the property deed, tax records, and utility bills in my study," she said, her voice steady. "Though I'm curious why my word wasn't enough, why my presence in my own garden required 4 officers and 2 police cruisers." Her son continued writing, capturing every word. The morning had grown warmer, but no one moved to wipe away the sweat beading on their foreheads. The scene had taken on the gravity of something that would be discussed in community meetings, in law offices, in police briefings for months to come. "One more thing," Dorothy's son said, closing his notebook but keeping his phone recording. "I'd like to know what training your department provides regarding community relations and racial bias. My office will be following up on that as well." He pulled out a business card and handed it to Officer Wilson. "You can expect our formal records request by this afternoon. I trust everything will be preserved appropriately." The neighborhood had fallen completely silent, as if holding its breath. Even the morning birds seemed to be waiting to see what would happen next. The only movement was the gentle swaying of Dorothy's roses in the breeze, their petals catching the sunlight like tiny flags of defiance. The weight of the morning's tension shifted as a third police car pulled up to the scene. This one moved more slowly, deliberately, its lights off. The door opened to reveal a police supervisor, his silver badge catching the morning light as he stepped out. Dorothy's son recognized him immediately from community meetings and previous cases, Lieutenant Baker, a 25-year veteran of the force. The lieutenant took in the scene with experienced eyes. 4 officers, 2 civilians, multiple neighbors recording on their phones, and Dorothy's roses bearing silent witness to it all. His footsteps were measured as he approached, each step seeming to carry the weight of similar situations he'd handled over his long career. "Counselor," he nodded to Dorothy's son, then turned to Dorothy herself. "Mrs. Washington, I believe we met at last month's Community Relations Board meeting. Those lemon squares you brought were exceptional." His voice carried a note of genuine respect, tinged with what might have been embarrassment at finding his officers surrounding a woman he knew to be a pillar of the community. Dorothy's son kept his phone recording but lowered it slightly. "Lieutenant Baker, I was just discussing with your officers the concerning nature of this response to a call about my mother gardening in her own yard." His tone remained professional, but there was an edge to it that spoke of countless similar cases, countless similar mornings. The lieutenant nodded, turning to Officer Wilson. "Fill me in, please. What exactly are we dealing with here?" The lead officer's report came out hesitant now, each word seeming to stick in his throat as he realized how it would sound. "We received a call about suspicious activity from a resident who reported someone they thought didn't belong in the neighborhood. The caller," Dorothy's son interjected smoothly, "reported my mother, a 43-year resident of this street, for the suspicious activity of tending her award-winning roses. The same roses, I might add, that took first place at the county fair last summer. Lieutenant Baker, I believe you were one of the judges." A slight smile crossed the lieutenant's face, though his eyes remained serious. "Indeed I was. Best roses I've seen in 20 years of judging." He turned to his officers, his expression hardening. "And how exactly did we escalate from a single call about gardening to 4 officers and 2 cruisers?" The youngest officer shifted uncomfortably, his boots crushing a few fallen rose petals. Dorothy watched them flutter to the ground, thinking of all the mornings she'd spent nurturing these flowers, never imagining they'd become the backdrop for such a scene. "We were following protocol for a potential break-in," one of the officers began, but the lieutenant held up his hand. "Protocol?" He gestured to Dorothy, still standing dignified among her roses. "Protocol is to question a respected retired teacher whose property taxes have probably paid all our salaries about breaking into her own home. Protocol is to surround a grandmother in her garden without proper cause." The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows across the lawn. Mrs. Chen was still recording from her porch, and Mr. Thompson had been joined by his wife, both watching intently. The school bus had long since passed, but the story of this morning would surely make its way through the neighborhood's children by afternoon. "Now," the lieutenant continued, "I believe we need to identify who made this call and have a serious discussion about proper use of emergency services." He turned to Dorothy. "Mrs. Washington, I apologize for this disruption to your morning. I assure you this incident will be thoroughly reviewed." Dorothy's son stepped forward slightly. Yes, it will. My office will be filing a formal request for all records related to this incident, including the original call. We'll also be requesting a review of department protocols regarding response escalation and racial bias training. The lieutenant nodded, unsurprised. He'd worked with Dorothy's son before and knew his reputation for thoroughness. Of course, you'll have our full cooperation. He turned to his officers. Gentlemen, I believe we're done here. Back to your patrol areas. The officers began moving toward their vehicles, their earlier aggressive stance replaced by something that looked like shame. The youngest one paused, looking at the crushed rose petals under his feet. "Ma'am," he said softly to Dorothy, "I'm sorry about your flowers." Dorothy looked at him with the same steady gaze she used on countless students over the years. "Plants can be replaced, young man. But trust, once broken, takes much longer to grow back." The morning breeze carried her words across the lawn, past the departing officers, to the neighbors who were still watching. It was the kind of moment that would be remembered, repeated, reflected upon in community meetings and family discussions for months to come. As the police cars pulled away one by one, Dorothy's son finally stopped recording. He looked at his mother, still standing proud among her roses, her gardening gloves now stained with dew and dignity. "Those lemon squares you made for the community meeting," he said with a slight smile, "they really were exceptional." Dorothy finally allowed herself a small laugh, the tension of the morning beginning to fade. "Well, you know what your father always said, sometimes the best response to bitterness is a little bit of sweetness." The neighborhood began to stir back to life. Mrs. Chen crossed the street, heading toward Dorothy with determined steps that suggested tea and conversation would soon follow. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson approached as well, their faces showing concern and support. The morning sun continued its climb, casting new light on Dorothy's roses. They stood unchanged by the drama that had unfolded around them, their petals still reaching toward the sky with the same determination as their caretaker. The day would go on, but this morning had changed something in the garden, in the neighborhood, in the hearts of all who had witnessed it. 2 weeks after the garden incident, Dorothy's living room was filled to capacity. Neighbors squeezed onto her floral sofa and brought in extra chairs from their own homes. The scent of her fresh-baked lemon squares mixed with the aroma of Mrs. Chen's jasmine tea, creating an atmosphere that felt both serious and welcoming. Police Lieutenant Baker sat in one corner, his uniform crisp but his posture relaxed, a cup of tea cooling beside him. Officer Wilson and the young officer from that morning were there too, this time in civilian clothes, looking somewhat uncomfortable but present nonetheless. Dorothy's son stood near the fireplace, his legal pad replaced by community meeting agenda notes. First, Dorothy addressed the room, her teacher's voice still carrying the same quiet authority it had held for 40 years. "I want to thank everyone for coming. What happened in my garden that morning isn't just my story, it's our community's story." She looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes with the same dignity she'd shown that morning among her roses. Her son stepped forward, his usual courtroom demeanor softened for this more intimate setting. "The police department has agreed to several important changes," he announced, glancing at Lieutenant Baker, who nodded in confirmation. "First, they're revising their response protocols for neighborhood calls. Second, they're implementing new training programs focused on community relations and bias awareness." Mrs. Thompson raised her hand, just as she'd done years ago in Dorothy's third-grade classroom. "But what about the person who made the call? Who would do that to Mrs. Washington, of all people?" The room grew quiet. Dorothy smoothed her skirt, the same calm gesture she'd used countless times while handling difficult classroom situations. "The caller was new to our neighborhood," she said gently. "They didn't know me, didn't know our community's history. That's not an excuse, but it's an opportunity for us to do better at welcoming new neighbors, at building bridges instead of walls." The young officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he addressed Dorothy, "I wanted everyone to know. That morning changed how I think about police work. Changed how I'll respond to calls like that in the future." His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his words carrying the weight of genuine reflection. Lieutenant Baker spoke up from his corner. "We're using the body camera footage from that morning in our training sessions now. With Mrs. Washington's permission, of course. It's becoming a powerful teaching tool about how quickly assumptions can escalate a situation and how professional intervention can de-escalate it." The afternoon sun slanted through Dorothy's windows, catching the family photos on her walls. 43 years of memories in this house, children growing up, neighbors coming and going, community changing and evolving. Outside, her roses continued their quiet blooming, unaware of their role in sparking change. Mr. Chen, who rarely spoke at community meetings, stood up slowly. "My wife showed me her video from that morning," he said, his accent thick with emotion. "Made me remember when we first moved here, 30 years ago. Mrs. Washington was first person to welcome us, brought us garden tomatoes and friendship. Now we must do same for new neighbors." Dorothy's son had been taking notes, but now he set his pad aside. "This isn't just about one morning in one garden," he said. "It's about who we want to be as a community. The legal changes matter, but what matters more is how we move forward together." The discussion continued as the afternoon deepened. People shared stories, times they'd felt out of place, times they'd made assumptions, times they'd learned better. The Thompson children, who had witnessed everything from their driveway that morning, presented Dorothy with hand-drawn pictures of her garden, complete with police cars transformed into butterflies. A new family that had moved in down the street listened intently, their expressions showing both concern and hope. Dorothy made sure they had extra lemon squares, remembering how it felt to be new, to want to belong. "Next weekend," she told them, "I'm teaching a gardening class. First lesson is roses, you're all welcome to join." As the meeting wound down, plans were made. The neighborhood watch would be restructured, focusing on building connections rather than suspicion. Monthly community dinners would be organized, rotating between homes. A mentoring program would pair longtime residents with newcomers, sharing history and building understanding. Lieutenant Baker stood to leave, pausing by Dorothy's roses, visible through the living room window. "You know," he said, "we're planning to start a community garden at the precinct. We could use some expert advice, if you're willing." Dorothy smiled, the same smile that had encouraged countless students over the years. "Every garden needs good soil to grow," she said, "just like every community needs trust and understanding. I'd be happy to help plant both." As the sun set, casting long shadows across Dorothy's garden, the last few neighbors lingered, helping to clean up teacups and rearrange furniture. The young officer stopped at the door, looking back at the roses he had accidentally crushed 2 weeks ago. New buds were already forming, reaching toward the light. Mrs. Chen was the final guest to leave, pausing to hug Dorothy tightly. "You teach us all," she whispered, "not just children, not just about flowers. You teach us about dignity, about strength." Dorothy stood in her doorway, watching her neighbors walk home in the golden evening light. Her son placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You okay, Mom?" She nodded, thinking of all the mornings she'd spent in her garden, all the lessons she'd taught in her classroom, all the changes she'd seen in this neighborhood over 43 years. "You know what your father used to say," she replied, her voice warm with memory. "Sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow in unexpected places, from moments that seemed like nothing but thorns." As night fell softly over the neighborhood, Dorothy's roses swayed gently in the evening breeze, their petals catching the last light of day. They stood as quiet sentinels, bearing witness to how one morning in a garden had begun to transform an entire community, one conversation, one connection, one moment of understanding at a time.